Okay, so we've got Gypsy Wife sections 1 through 5 so far. Section 6 is huge. Now there are 6 different types of blocks in section 6. There are square and square, one is bordered. There are hourglass, some all are bordered, one is squared. There are pinwheel with or without border. There are courthouse steps with border or multiple borders. We've done all of those before. We can do it again. The only new blocks, the new designs, are Nurse's Cross and Indian Hatchet. Hourglass. And there's 2 hourglass in section 6. There's an hourglass with border squared, and there's just an hourglass with border. So I'm going to make them out of the same fabric. The way that you can make the hourglass is create 2 squares and then draw a line diagonally, stitch on either side of that line, and then cut along that line. And that gives you the 2 squares, and then you flip and repeat that to stitch and make the hourglass. So my 2 hourglasses will look the same, and then these are the 2 sets of borders. The final piece is this 1 square that will make the 1 hourglass with squared. Okay, so here the 2 squares have been stitched together on either side of that center line. Cut along that center line. Okay, so what you end up with are the 2 half square triangle blocks. Flip one and match up the center seam, making sure that it's opposite colors. Again, you can draw a line down the center and then stitch on either side of that line, cut, and then flip open, and you end up with 2 hourglass blocks. Okay, so at this point we're treating these 2 hourglass squares a little bit differently. So we've got the hourglass with border, which results at a 4-inch finished block, and I highly recommend squaring up the hourglass before adding the borders. Now the borders will give you a little bit of an idea because the hourglass square might end up bigger than the border. So you're going to want to square up the hourglasses squares to match the border. So this one is just a bordered hourglass. Once you attach the borders and press open, that one is done. This one is a little more complicated. So this does follow the instructions on page 21 in the lower right hand corner. So as you can see, the sizes are a little bit different. You can make those hourglass the same, but you do need to measure and square it up. Okay friends, so here is our first hourglass block, and then this hourglass block is the one with the border and then squared. So I'm following the instructions on page 21 to make the hourglass with the border and the squared around the outside to make a finished 5-inch hourglass bordered squared block. Guess what? There's an errata for this block. Page 21 hourglass block, bottom right hand column. So the errata actually tells you to cut 2 squares and then divide those squares just in half. So you're going to end up with 2 squares divided in half. And then that will now fit onto the hourglass bordered block. So I'm going to cut my 4 triangles and show you the assembly for this one. Okay, so now for the smaller center hourglass block with the border size is a little bit different, and then cut the 2 squares. So these two first, press that open, and then the final two squares. And this will result in the correct hourglass block with border squared for section 6. I apologize for the confusion on that. I had to double check the errata and it kind of caught me up. So I wanted to make sure that I was giving the correct information for this block. So that is what the hourglass block should look like. The next type of filler block for section 6 is the pinwheel. So there's one block that is just the pinwheel, and then there is a pinwheel with border. So to make the pinwheel, you're going to put two different squares together, right sides together, draw a line down the center, and then stitch on either side of that line. Cut along the solid center line, fold open and press. And the result is half square triangles. To make a pinwheel, you use 4 of these half square triangle blocks, arrange them so that they form a pinwheel shape with the similar color. If you're scrappy, you're scrappy. With a similar color going to the center, stitch, stitch, stitch. So 2 pinwheel square blocks, one without the border and then one with the border. I use different fabrics. I'm trying to keep scrappy, so I used different fabrics for my pinwheel with border. So just attach the border and then that block is done. And then the last filler block for section 6 I'm doing is the courthouse steps. So there are 2 different types of courthouse step blocks. There is a 1 border courthouse steps and you need 2 of those. And then there is a 3 border courthouse steps and you need 1 of those. So courthouse steps is pretty simple. You take the center square, border, 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 border. The other one is just 1 row of border, so you should have your courthouse steps done in no time. And there are the 2 identical size single border courthouse steps and then the 3 border courthouse steps. I love this one. That was so fun to make. Alright, square and square. First finished size is the small size. So I need 7 of those. 7 small square and square. So I just stacked all of my fabric up that I'm going to use for my center square, cut out my squares, and I have the center all ready for all 7 of those small square and square blocks. And then I just did the layer and cut for the 4 small squares that go on the corner for all 7 fabrics that I chose. Mine's scrappy, it makes it easier. It definitely was a little fiddly getting the small squares cut, especially since I had the camera right there, but I think it works out just fine. So now we've got 7 different squares, 7 different square and square cuts, and I chose all pretty much dark center squares, and then we're just going to start building the square and square by placing the smaller squares on the corners, sewing the diagonal line, opening that up and pressing, and then doing the opposite squares, sewing the diagonal line, and then we end up with the square and square. So I'm going to stitch up these 7 squares and I will be right back. So again, the square in the square process is you sew 1 small square to one corner, another small square to another corner, stitch diagonally in the center, trim the outside seam allowance, and then fold open and press. And then the next step is to put the final square in the 2 corners. that have not been sewn yet, stitch diagonally and fold open to create the square and square. So the finished square and square has that center and then the 4 triangles on the outside. So 7 of these, once you've completed 7 small square in square blocks, you are a third of the way done with the blocks in this section 6. Okay, 7 small square and square blocks. That is 1/3 of the total number of blocks in section 6. The next block is also a square and square, but a little bit larger size. So 3 of those are needed for section 6. And again, the process is the center square and then the 4 smaller squares that are stitched on the diagonal to the 4 corners and pressed open. So 3 finished square and square at the larger size. And the last single square and square is a simple square and square with a border around it. So once the square and square is done, add the short borders to opposite sides and then the long borders to opposite sides. And that is the 1 square and square with border in section 6. The Indian hatchet block uses 4 squares and the same technique as the square and square, except it only goes on 1 corner. So the little squares go on the 2 opposite corners, stitch diagonally just like for a square and a square, fold back and press, and that's it. Do not finish the square and square. So the Indian hatchet has the 4 squares. The squares are made similar to square and square, except the smaller squares are only attached to 2 opposite sides and not all 4 opposite sides. Then trim the 1/4 inch seam allowance outside of the stitch line and press open to create the square. And then those 4 squares are assembled together to create the final Indian hatchet block. And there's my Indian hatchet. Alright, the last block I'm going to be working on is Nurse's Cross, and that is one of the blocks in the Gypsy Wife that has lots of little cutting and piecing fun. So there are very specific measurements for each piece that goes into Nurse's Cross. So we start with a center square and take 2 rectangles and attach that to that center square. And then these additional 2 rectangles will make the cross part. In order to do that, we're going to use these triangular pieces along the sides of the top and bottom part of the cross. And the triangles go with the right angle in and then the hypotenuse on the outside. So these will be stitched to either side of the top and bottom part of the cross. And then this point is going to be trimmed. So the point will eventually form the square. But the first step is to attach these triangles to the rectangle cross section. So the result are these little butterfly looking pieces, and they go on the top and the bottom of the previously made unit with the center square. I'm going to wait to trim these off until I have the whole center square assembled. Okay, so this is the center square. Now it does require some trimming. So what you end up seeing is if you cut off each of those corner rectangles, that creates a nice new point for the square. So just trim each of those corners, and it will be in line with the hypotenuse of the triangles, and that creates the new square. So I'm going to trim that up, and then once it's trimmed, that is the new on point center square for Nurse's Cross. So the next step is to add the triangles. These are created from two squares cut diagonally. So this is a basic square in square process. So you're treating the pieced center as a square, and then the triangles to go on the opposite sides and then press out, much like a square in a square. Okay, and then the next step is to continue building out the final square, and in order to do that we need to create some units. So there is a longer rectangle and a shorter rectangle, and this has triangles attached to the sides. To each of the rectangles. And then one final triangle at the point. So there's the 4 identical units with the long rectangle and the end triangles, 4 identical units with the shorter rectangle and the 2 end triangles, and then there will be 4 triangles that attach to that final unit, and then they all get stitched together. So I'm going to leave that there and create a complete unit so that you can see what that looks like. Okay, so corner units to go on the Nurse's Cross block. Rectangle, rectangle, and then triangles to assemble that. So the triangles go on either side of the rectangle, the smaller, and then finally the corner triangle. So the way that the corner triangle goes, it goes the different direction to make that triangle, and then the result is the triangular unit that will go onto the 4 sides of the Nurse's Cross. And Nurse's Cross is my final block for section 6, so I am ready to assemble section 6. Section 6 is going to be difficult to assemble, so take your time. You will get through it. Lay it out if you have the space, if you have the availability to put it up on a wall, even better. But yeah, section 6 is kind of overwhelming, so take your time with it and we'll get through it. Of course, when it all starts to come together, it's pretty satisfying. And section 6 fully assembled.